August 1944. A tense, secure Allied command chateau near Falaise, France. Inside the thick stone walls, a massive, coordinated Allied push is tearing through the German lines. But on the western edge of the sector, the advance abruptly grinds to a halt. A British armored division stops dead in its tracks, choosing to consolidate positions rather than push forward, completely abandoning the left flank of an advancing American armored unit. This sudden halt leaves the Americans brutally exposed to a devastating German 88mm counterattack on the open ridge. Frantic American radio calls for immediate help ring out, but they are casually brushed off by the British commander, who prioritizes a neat, orderly map over the lives of his allies. Men are burning in their tanks while an aristocratic officer finishes his tea. General George S. Patton will deliver an ultimatum that forces a coward to choose between facing the enemy or facing the raw fury of the American Third Army. This is the story of the day General George S. Patton discovered that an Allied division had frozen in place, abandoning an American flank to the enemy during a vital advance. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the myths of military glory. Colonel David Harris was 38 years old, hailed from the steel town of Pittsburgh, and commanded a forward armor element of the American 2nd Armored Division. He had fought his way through the soft sand of North Africa and the rocky hills of Sicily, losing his younger brother to an enemy mortar barrage outside Gela. Harris was a practical tank commander who wore oil-stained fatigues and slept on the engine deck of his Sherman tank to stay warm. He knew the precise capabilities of his machines and the exact breaking point of his men. His sole focus was keeping his crews alive while pushing the line forward, a task made impossible when his flank evaporated into thin air. He found himself trapped in a smoking valley, watching his lead tanks burst into flames because an Allied unit refused to move. General Sir Arthur Pendleton was 55 years old, a career aristocrat from an ancient estate in Gloucestershire, and commanded the British Armoured Brigade on the left. He believed the war should be fought with the deliberate precision of a chess match, strictly adhering to the manuals written at the Staff College before the war. He wore a perfectly tailored wool uniform with immaculate brass buttons, and he refused to map his movements without a clean, leather-bound folder on his desk. To Pendleton, the battlefield was a theoretical problem to be solved with caution and proper alignment, not a frantic brawl in the mud. He openly despised what he viewed as reckless American impatience, preferring to hold his ground rather than risk a sloppy formation. His rigid adherence to outdated doctrine meant his men sat idle while the Americans bled. By August 1944, the battle for Normandy had reached a boiling point as the Allied armies attempted to trap the German 7th Army in a pocket near Falaise. The German lines were fracturing under immense pressure, but their rearguard units fought with desperation, using every hedgerow and ridge to inflict maximum casualties on the advancing Allied armor. Speed and coordination were the only ways to seal the gap and end the campaign in northern France. If one unit faltered or slowed down, the entire line would buckle, exposing the flanks of neighboring regiments to lethal counterattacks from hidden enemy anti-tank batteries. In this chaotic environment, a dangerous gap began to form between the British and American sectors. Many senior commanders were exhausted by weeks of brutal fighting through the dense bocage country and had grown overly cautious, choosing to secure their immediate gains rather than risk aggressive maneuvers. Some higher-ups turned a blind eye to these delays, chalking them up to the natural friction of war or logistical strain. This tolerance for hesitation created a lethal vulnerability on the battlefield, where an officer's desire for an orderly map could mean total disaster for the men on the ground. While the high command debated operational boundaries in rear echelon tents, the immediate consequences of these choices were felt on the front lines, where steel met high explosive shells. The ridge outside the village became a shooting gallery for the German defensive positions, and the American tank crews found themselves caught completely in the open. Down in the valley, the engine smoke and the smell of burning oil filled the air as the defensive perimeter began to fall apart. The radio inside the secure stone chateau crackled with static and the desperate screams of men under fire. Major Robert Vance, a 31-year-old operations officer from Chicago, serving with the 2nd Armored Division, held the microphone with a white-knuckled grip as he stared at the British commander. "We are taking heavy anti-tank fire on our left flank," Vance said. General Pendleton did not look up from his teacup. "Our current position is entirely secure," the general replied, "sir. My commander is under direct attack by German 88mm guns because your armor stopped moving," Vance said. "It is prudent military doctrine to consolidate our positions before we push any further into the sector," Pendleton said. "Your consolidation is leaving our tanks to burn on the ridge," Vance said. "The division must maintain a neat and orderly line on the map to prevent an uncoordinated breakthrough." Pendleton said, "Colonel Harris is screaming for support right now because his flank is completely gone," Vance said. "American aggression is frequently reckless and lacks strategic patience," Pendleton said. "We are fighting the same enemy, and our men are dying because you refuse to advance," Vance said. "A proper commander does not alter his textbook strategy for the sake of battlefield impatience," Pendleton said. "Sir, this is not impatience, it is a slaughter," Vance said. "I will not compromise the safety of my entire brigade for a disorganized maneuver," Pendleton said. "If you do not move your armor forward immediately, our entire forward element will be wiped out," Vance said. "My orders stand, as the textbook dictates that we hold this line until the rear echelons arrive," Pendleton said. "This is cowardice disguised as doctrine," Vance said. "You will remember your rank and your place when speaking to a superior Allied officer," Pendleton said. Vance realized that no amount of logic or appeals to shared sacrifice would move the man behind the desk. The aristocratic officer was entirely content to watch the American lines shatter if it meant keeping his own uniform clean. Vance dropped the microphone onto the table, turned away from the map room without saluting, and ran to the field telephone in the hallway. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up to the front gates of the stone chateau, mud splattering across the bumper. 4 polished stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers rested against his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the map room unannounced. The staff officers fell completely silent as his boots snapped against the floorboards. Patton studied the room. Then he spoke. "Is this the brigade headquarters, General?" Patton asked. "It is," Pendleton said, gesturing to a silver tray. "We were just reviewing the sector maps over tea." "And your armor is currently sitting idle while the flank is exposed?" Patton asked. "We are consolidating our lines in accordance with proper doctrine," Pendleton said. "Are you aware that American tank crews are burning alive on the ridge right now?" Patton asked. "Merely necessity requires that we prioritize an orderly formation over reckless maneuvers," Pendleton said. Patton walked straight to the table. His eyes locked on the British commander. He did not raise his voice, but the cold weight of his words cut through the room. "You sit in this rear echelon chateau and talk about doctrine while your allies are being chewed to pieces by 88mm fire. You call it strategic patience. But the men on the front lines have a different word for it. The American 2nd Armored Division advanced because they believed they had an honorable partner on their left flank. They did not expect their ally to freeze in place to keep a map looking pristine. Prudence is just a fancy word for fear, General. You have used your textbook as a shield to hide from the reality of this fight, and that shield ends today. You have 2 options. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. You will immediately radio your brigade and order every single tank to advance and plug that gap, or I will personally drive back to my command post. If I do, I will redirect the entire artillery complement of the American Third Army to fire directly in front of your trenches. You will be forced to move forward just to avoid the friendly fire. You will fight the Germans today, General, or by God you will fight me. Decide now." Pendleton stared at the ivory revolvers, then at the absolute certainty in Patton's eyes. The aristocratic officer turned toward his desk, his hand trembling as he reached for the radio microphone to issue the advance order. The radio room erupted into a frenzy of motion as the British operators scrambled to fulfill the sudden directive. Staff officers quickly discarded their teacups, the porcelain rattling against the wooden table as the frantic transmission went out across the tactical network. Down in the valley, the idling British tank engines roared to life, coughing thick clouds of black exhaust into the damp afternoon air. The heavy iron tracks ground into the mud, shifting the massive machines forward into the blinding smoke screen. American crews on the ridge heard the heavy rumble of Allied armor before they saw the hulls break through the tree line. The sudden arrival of British fire support immediately slammed into the German positions, forcing the anti-tank gunners to abandon their pieces. Soldiers on both sides watched in disbelief as the gap in the line closed within minutes under the threat of absolute destruction. Witnesses later recalled the sheer terror on the faces of the chateau staff, who knew the American general would have executed his threat without a single moment of hesitation. The entire sector changed in an instant, not because of a sudden shift in strategy, but because a single commander chose the fury of the battlefield over the comfort of his map room. Colonel David Harris returned home to Pittsburgh after the German surrender, his body carrying the scars of 3 major campaigns. He spent the remainder of his life working in the local steel mills, refusing to speak about the war to his neighbors or his children. He kept a small piece of shrapnel on his dresser until his death in 1982, a quiet reminder of the men he left behind in the valley near Falaise. General Sir Arthur Pendleton faced an immediate inquiry regarding his tactical decisions during the Normandy breakout, though his aristocratic connections shielded him from a formal court-martial. He was quietly reassigned to a secondary administrative post in London before retiring to his family estate in Gloucestershire in 1948. He spent his final years writing bitter articles for military journals, defending his rigid interpretation of pre-war doctrine until he died in 1967. Patton never recorded the details of the confrontation in his official diaries, nor did he mention the ultimatum to the Supreme Command. He left only a brief note in his personal correspondence to his wife, detailing the necessity of breaking through institutional fear to keep an army moving forward. He believed that a commander who valued a pristine map over the lives of his soldiers had no place on a modern battlefield, and he treated the incident as a routine correction of an Allied failure. Some historians have argued that Patton's aggressive intervention violated the established chain of command and needlessly strained the delicate political alliance between the Western powers during a critical phase of the campaign. They contend that rigid adherence to pre-war doctrine was a necessary safeguard against chaotic battlefield breakdowns. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the American general's decisive actions saved hundreds of Allied lives and prevented a catastrophic failure of the entire sector. What is certain is that the gap in the Allied line was closed within minutes of the confrontation, securing the flank and allowing the push toward Falaise to resume without further delay. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have handled the situation through standard bureaucratic channels? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the truth behind the myths of military glory, make sure to subscribe.